Hey there, internet friends. The other day there was a situation that occurred in my life that was a bit uncomfortable and left me dwelling on the idea of what it means to be offended and why we get offended to begin with. What is it about us humans that in one moment everything is fine and the next moment all of a sudden all these emotions begin to well up? Now, obviously, there's a science behind the physiological chain reaction that is part of our human makeup. But the more I thought about it, the more foreign it felt. I began to feel very much outside myself and distant from the emotion and connection to it. It was like as if observing for the first time with no concept or perception of interpretation. It was a little weird and fascinating. Now, I'll be the first to tell you I'm far from perfect, but it did get me thinking about how we as humans get offended. I then expanded the circle to encompass the current hypersensitive environment we live in of political ideologies, cancel culture, and endless finger pointing. You don't have to go too far to understand that we are all complicit in some way, and it needs to be reined in somehow. Okay, now, after pondering the subject for a while, I came up with some thoughts, and I want to share them with you. I think we can all benefit. Take what you like and leave what you don't. Okay, so when I was a boy, I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and at the time my mom was quite politically active. I remember one night stumbling into the TV room where my mother sat fixated on some political pundit sounding off about the ill-conceived notions of the other party. I asked her, why does the man hate the other guy so much? My mom stopped what she was doing, turned down the volume and looked over to me with a smile and said, well, actually, son, it's all a bit of a show. Most of these politicians will argue passionately about their views, and they certainly feel strongly about them, but it's not uncommon to later see the same men out to lunch or even on the golf course. Now, this made sense to me, as I behaved in a very similar way in competitive sports, and so off I went to go do whatever I was doing. But nowadays, that competitive spirit has devolved into bloodthirsty, tribalized factions. Now, make no mistake, I'm not reminiscent about some fictionalized time where everyone got along and all was well. We all know this has never been the case. But quite honestly, it seems people now are wound up so tight that even a gentle breeze will set them off. People on either side of the political spectrum truly despise one another, and sadly, it doesn't stop there. The polarization of ideologies has infected every facet of our culture, and we find ourselves retreating back into arcane methods where reason has been replaced by groupthink and mob mentality. The problem is systemic and is not just isolated to politics. It has metastasized into every area of life, society, and even our families. No one is safe and everyone is affected, and its growth, well, it's exponential. Forget about the technological singularity. The one staring us in the face right now is an ideological one which will be realized far sooner, and the consequences, well, a blistering descent through Dante's 9 levels of hell. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. It's not a sign on which to see. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's not my place. I'm more of the mind that my right to swing my arm ends where your nose begins. But I am going to ask you to consider, or even possibly reflect, on a few concepts. Now, take a minute to consider this. What exactly does it mean to be offended? Go ahead. Say it out loud. Offended. Do you feel a barrier going up? Do you feel a little bit silly? Let me ask you, do you feel wise? The following quote is by neurologist, psychiatrist, and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. It goes like this. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. Now, this makes sense, and it's empowering. I mean, we need not submit to the animalistic knee-jerk response of our emotions. In this space between, we find the freedom to choose our action or inaction. In this space, there is autonomy of person and individual responsibility. Now, isn't this something we all seek? However, Oddly enough, if we look out at the cancel culture which has sprung up around us, we see something quite paradoxical. It seems to proclaim autonomy and individual responsibility, while at the same time seeking to bend the will of the world to their own ideology. A recipe for disaster, and kind of where we find ourselves nowadays. So when considering Viktor Frankl's space between stimulus and response, the story of the bully and the Buddha came to mind. I'd like to share it with you, and it goes like this. It is said that one day the Buddha was walking through a village, minding his own business, when a group of young men who thought themselves pretty keen decided to give him a hard time. They began to follow him, cursing, laughing, and making fun the whole time. Now the Buddha, he paid no attention and kept on his path. The leader of the bullies was put off by the Buddha's lack of response, and so began to berate him even louder, and the group followed along. Still, the Buddha paid no attention and serenely continued along his path. Now this quite angered the bully and his gang, and so the accusations, harsh words, and criticism continued escalating in volume and tone. After many minutes, the bully and his gang grew tired, and finally in exhaustion they said to the Buddha, "Hey old man, what's your problem? Can't you see that we've been on your case for the last 20 minutes? What are you, stupid? Why don't you respond?" At that point, the Buddha stopped and spoke. He said, "Young man, if I give you a present and you do not accept it, who does the present belong to?" Well, the bully responded, "Me, of course." And the Buddha said, "Exactly," and then continued on the path, leaving the bully and his gang to figure out what just transpired. Now, the moral of the story is precisely what Viktor Frankl tells us. We have a choice. Now, it's not too difficult to consider the story of the bully and the Buddha, or Viktor Frankl's space between, and tend to agree with them. Personally, I remember when I first heard these two examples, it felt like someone just handed me the keys to the universe. It was rational, logical, it was a moment of clarity. But it's one thing to have these aha moments, and quite another to incorporate them into your life. You see, unfortunately, these moments tend to leave just as fast as they arrived. I would say the reason for this is what I call neural momentum. Neural momentum is the accumulated buildup of one's experiences and the interpretation of it. This is realized through the mechanism of what I like to call the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper is a filter between the outer objective reality and one's inner subjective reality. Now, unfortunately, my gatekeeper was more captivated by my sinful nature, and so consequently allowed in a few too many bright ideas that in the long haul were more destructive than I could have imagined. You see, over time, momentum has a way of slowly building upon its trajectory, pace, and accumulated mass, such to the point that deviating from the current path would require a force typically outside of oneself. You've heard the saying, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks." Now, I would say a more accurate representation of this would be to say, it takes a lot to teach an old dog new tricks. It used to be the prevailing belief that after a certain age, our brain lost the plasticity needed to change the way we think. Turns out this was wrong. Apparently, the brain's plasticity endures a lifetime. Our brain can and will always have the ability to generate new neural pathways. Now, as adults, our neural pathways are more like well-established highways. So to begin to alter the traffic in a new direction can present significant difficulties. But it's possible. It was Socrates who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And in that vein, I want to present the following thought experiment. Maybe it'll shed some insight on how our neural pathways influence our perceptions. So, let's say you're out driving through town when all of a sudden out of the corner of your eye, you see your significant other smiling and walking out of a restaurant with a very attractive person of the opposite sex. How would you read the situation? What's going through your mind? How might you react? Now, I'm sure you can imagine a variety of scenarios, and depending on your existing neural pathways, nothing may come of it, or something may come of it. You see, our neural pathways dictate our perceptions, emotions, and behavioral response. If not properly aligned with the objective world, bad things can ensue. It really just all depends on how you've been wired up. The fact is, we really don't know what just transpired until we obtain more information. But the point of the thought experiment is to understand how our neural pathways determine our behavior and that not all is what it seems. There's a great video on YouTube, and I'll leave a link in the description, of a young boy who very wisely says, "What we practice, we will become good at." So the boy asked the question, what do you practice? Do you practice joy? Do you practice patience? Or do you practice complaining? Because if you practice complaining, over time you'll become very good at it. And there will be no situation where you cannot find some fault or something to complain about. Wise words from a young boy. Now let's get back to those aha moments, their speedy arrival and departure, and how neural momentum is the reason for this. A great way to conceptualize neural momentum is to imagine your brain like a large, untouched field of grass, and you're going to make a trail on it. On day one, the grass is about waist high, but you forge ahead in an exhausting 2-mile loop. The next day, you do the same and find it's a little bit easier. After several months, the loop you hike begins to form an identifiable trail. At this point, hiking the trail is much easier and bears little encumbrances. After a few more years, the trail is solid and well formed. Now keep in mind, during all this time, the grass on either side of the trail has continued to grow and is now dense, thick, and about head high. Now let's say some new information has come to light and you realize a change in direction would be to your significant advantage. Let's call this the aha moment. You think to yourself, wow, this is revolutionary, and you get really excited. But a few minutes go by and you realize how difficult it's going to be to implement this change. All of a sudden, this revolutionary concept begins to lose its luster, and you think to yourself, maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. But then one day you realize the pain of not making the change will eventually outweigh the pain of making the change. So you decide to forge ahead with the new trail. So you begin, inch by inch, yard by yard, scrape by scrape, and day by day. You persevere, and finally after a couple months, you manage to beat down a new path. And after a few years, the new trail is as good as the old, and the benefits, well, worth it. This, my friends, is pretty much how remapping neural pathways works in the brain, and unfortunately, it could take just as long. But again, it's possible. The new trail in our example represents new ways of conceiving the world around us, and hopefully these new perceptions will allow us to be better aligned with the objective world and how we represent ourselves in it. And one thing I should mention, and it's pretty key, in our example, as we beat down the new hiking path, the old path begins to grow over, and eventually it's indistinguishable from the rest of the tall grass. Now, the point of all this is to bring attention to the only thing we truly have the power to change, and that's oneself. It begins by bringing awareness to that space between stimulus and response, and what we choose to practice in that moment. It's to grasp that in order to be offended, one must first accept the offense. And it's recognizing the futility and disastrous consequences of attempting to bend the will of the world to one's own. And finally, change takes time. And it takes patience, but as I said before, is possible. Okay, everyone, that's all I got for you today. Thanks for tuning in and watching. Really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe, share and leave a comment. And till next time, thanks and God bless.